Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Kidnapped, Chapter 21, The Flight in the Heather, The Hue of Corrie Nakay. Early as day comes in the beginning of July, it was still dark when we reached our destination, a cleft in the head of a great mountain with a water running through the midst, and upon the one hand a shallow cave in a rock. Birches grew there and a thin pretty wood, which a little farther on was changed into a wood of pines. The burn was full of trout, the wood of cushat doves. On the open side of the mountain beyond, whaups would be always whistling, and cuckoos were plentiful. From the mouth of the cleft we looked down upon a part of Mamore and on the sea loch that divides that country from Appin, and this from so great a height as made it my continual wonder and pleasure to sit and behold them. The name of the cleft was the Hue of Corrie Nakay, and although from its height and being so near upon the sea, it was often beset with clouds, yet it was on the whole a pleasant place, and the 5 days we lived in it went happily. We slept in the cave, making our bed of heather bushes, which we cut for that purpose, and covering ourselves with Allan's greatcoat. There was a low concealed place in a turning of the glen where we were so bold as to make fire, so that we could warm ourselves when the clouds set in, and cook hot porridge, and grill the little trouts that we caught with our hands under the stones and overhanging banks of the burn. This was indeed our chief pleasure and business, and not only to save our meal against worse times, but with a rivalry that much amused us. We spent a great part of our days at the water side, stripped to the waist, and groping about, or as they say, guddling, for these fish. The largest we got might have been 1/4 of a pound, but they were of good flesh and flavor, and when broiled upon the coals lacked only a little salt to be delicious. In any by-time, Allan must teach me to use my sword, for my ignorance had much distressed him. And I think besides, as I had sometimes the upper hand of him in the fishing, he was not sorry to turn to an exercise where he had so much the upper hand of me. He made it somewhat more of a pain than need have been, for he stormed at me all through the lessons in a very violent matter of scolding, and would push me so close that I made sure he must run me through the body. I was often tempted to turn tail, but held my ground for all that, and got some profit of my lessons, if it was but to stand on guard with an assured countenance, which is often all that is required. So though I could never in the least please my master, I was not altogether displeased with myself. In the meanwhile, you are not to suppose that we neglected our chief business, which was to get away. "It will be many a long day," Allan said to me on our first morning, "before the redcoats think upon seeking Corrie Nakay. So now we must get word sent to James, and he must find the siller for us." "And how shall we send that word?" says I. "We are here in a desert place, which yet we dare not leave, and unless you get the fowls of the air to be your messengers, I see not what we shall be able to do." "I," said Allan, "you're a man of small contrivance, David." Thereupon he fell in a muse, looking in the embers of the fire, and presently, getting a piece of wood, he fashioned it in a cross, the 4 ends of which he blackened on the coals. Then he looked at me a little shyly. "Could you lend me my button?" says he. "It seems a strange thing to ask a gift again, but I own I am loath to cut another." I gave him the button, whereupon he strung it on a strip of his greatcoat, which he had used to bind the cross, and tying in a little sprig of birch and another of fir, he looked upon his work with satisfaction. "Now," said he, "there is a little clachan," what is called a hamlet in the English, not very far from Corrie Nakay, and it has the name of Coalasnacone. There are living many friends of mine whom I could trust with my life, and some that I am no just so sure of. You see, David, there will be money set upon our heads. James himself is to set money on them, and as for the Campbells, they would never spare siller when there was a Stuart to be hurt. If it was otherwise, I would go down to Coalasnacone whatever, and trust my life into these people's hands as lightly as I would trust another with my glove." "But being so," said I. "Being so," said he, "I would as lief they didna see me. There's bad folk everywhere, and what's far worse, weak ones. So when it comes dark again, I will steal down into that clachan, and set this that I have been making in the window of a good friend of mine, John Breck McCall, a bowman of Appins." "With all my heart," says I, "and if he finds it, what is he to think?" "Well," says Allan, "I wish he was a man of more penetration, for by my troth I am afraid he will make little enough of it. But this is what I have in my mind. This cross is something in the nature of the cross-terry or fiery cross, which is the signal of gathering in our clans. Yet he will know well enough the clan is not to rise, for there it is standing in his window, and no word with it. So he will say to himself, the clan is not to rise, but there is something. Then he will see my button, and that was Duncan Stewart's. And then he will say to himself, the son of Duncan is in the heather and has need of me. Well, said I, it may be, but even supposing so, there is a good deal of heather between here and the Forth. And that is a very true word, said Allan. But then John Breck will see the sprig of birch and the sprig of pine, and he will say to himself, if he is a man of any penetration at all, which I misdoubt, Allan will be lying in a wood which is both of pines and birches. Then he will think to himself, that is not so very rife hereabout, and then he will come and give us a look up in Corrynakill. And if he does not, David, the devil may fly away with him, for what I care, for he will no be worth the salt to his porridge. Amen, said I, drolling him a little, you're very ingenious. But would it not be simpler for you to write him a few words in black and white? And that is an excellent observe, Mr. Balfour of Shaw's, said Allan, drolling with me. And it would certainly be much simpler for me to write to him, but it would be a sore job for John Breck to read it. He would have to go to the school for 2-3 years, and it's possible we might be wearied waiting for him. So that night Allan carried down his fiery cross and set it in the bowman's window. He was troubled when he came back, for the dogs had barked and the folk run out from their houses, and he thought he had heard a clatter of arms and seen a redcoat come to one of the doors. On all accounts, we lay the next day in the borders of the wood and kept a close lookout, so that if it was John Breck that came, we might be ready to guide him, and if it was the redcoats, we should have time to get away. About noon, a man was to be spied, straggling up the open side of the mountain in the sun, and looking round him as he came from under his hand. No sooner had Allan seen him than he whistled. The man turned and came a little towards us. Then Allan would give another peep, and the man would come still nearer. And so by the sound of whistling, he was guided to the spot where we lay. He was a ragged, wild, bearded man, about 40, grossly disfigured with the smallpox, and looked both dull and savage. Although his English was very bad and broken, yet Allan, according to his very handsome use whenever I was by, would suffer him to speak no Gaelic. Perhaps the strained language made him appear more backward than he really was, but I thought he had little good will to serve us, and what he had was the child of terror. Allan would have had him carry a message to James, but the bowman would hear of no message. She was forget it, he said in his screaming voice, and would either have a letter or wash his hands of us. I thought Allan would be gravelled at that, for we lacked the means of writing in that desert. But he was a man of more resources than I knew, searched the wood until he found the quill of a cushat dove, which he shaped into a pen, made himself a kind of ink with gunpowder from his horn and water from the running stream, and tearing a corner from his French military commission, which he carried in his pocket like a talisman to keep him from the gallows, he sat down and wrote as follows. Dear kinsman, please send the money by the bearer to the place he kens of. Your affectionate cousin, A.S. This he entrusted to the bowman, who promised to make what manner of speed he best could, and carried it off with him down the hill. He was 3 full days gone, but about 5 in the evening of the 3rd, we heard a whistling in the wood, which Allan answered, and presently the bowman came up the waterside, looking for us right and left. He seemed less sulky than before, and indeed he was no doubt well pleased to have got to the end of such a dangerous commission. He gave us the news of the country, that it was alive with redcoats, that arms were being found, and poor folk brought in trouble daily, and that James and some of his servants were already clapped in prison at Fort William, under strong suspicion of complicity. It seemed it was noised on all sides that Allan Breck had fired the shot, and there was a bill issued for both him and me with £100 reward. This was all as bad as could be, and the little note the bowman had carried us from Mrs. Stewart was of a miserable sadness. In it she besought Allan not to let himself be captured, assuring him if he fell in the hands of the troops, both he and James were no better than dead men. The money she had sent was all she could beg or borrow, and she prayed heaven we could be doing with it. Lastly, she said, she enclosed us one of the bills in which we were described. This we looked upon with great curiosity, and not a little fear, partly as a man may look in a mirror, partly as he might look into the barrel of an enemy's gun to judge if it be truly aimed. Allan was advertised as a small, pock-marked active man of 35 or thereby, dressed in a feathered hat, a French side coat of blue with silver buttons and lace a great deal tarnished, a red waistcoat and breeches of black shag. And I, as a tall, strong lad of about 18, wearing an old blue coat, very ragged, an old Highland bonnet, a long homespun waistcoat, blue breeches, his legs bare, low country shoes wanting the toes, speaks like a lowlander, and has no beard. Allan was well enough pleased to see his finery so fully remembered and set down, only when he came to the word tarnish, he looked upon his lace like one a little mortified. As for myself, I thought I cut a miserable figure in the bill, and yet was well enough pleased too, for since I had changed these rags, the description had ceased to be a danger and become a source of safety. Allan, said I, you should change your clothes. Nay, troth, said Allan, I have nae others. A fine sight I would be if I went back to France in a bonnet. This put a second reflection in my mind, that if I were to separate from Allan and his telltale clothes, I should be safe against arrest, and might go openly about my business. Nor was this all, for suppose I was arrested when I was alone, there was little against me. But suppose I was taken in company with the reputed murderer, my case would begin to be grave. For generosity's sake, I dare not speak my mind upon this head, but I thought of it none the less. I thought of it all the more, too, when the bowman brought out a green purse with 4 guineas in gold, and the best part of another in small change. True, it was more than I had, but when Allan, with less than 5 guineas, had to get as far as France, I, with my less than 2, not beyond Queensferry, so that taking things in their proportion, Allan's society was not only a peril to my life, but a burden on my purse. But there was no thought of the sort in the honest head of my companion. He believed he was serving, helping, and protecting me, and what could I do but hold my peace and chafe and take my chance of it? It's little enough, said Allan, putting the purse in his pocket, but it'll do my business. And now, John Breck, if you will hand me over my button, this gentleman and me will be for taking the road. But the bowman, after feeling about in a hairy purse that hung in front of him in the Highland manner, though he wore otherwise the lowland habit with sea trousers, began to roll his eyes strangely, and at last said, Her nane so will loss it, meaning he thought he had lost it. What? Cried Allan. You will lose my button that was my father's before me? Now I will tell you what is in my mind, John Breck. It is in my mind that this is the worst day's work that you ever did since you were born. And as Allan spoke, he set his hands on his knees and looked at the bowman with a smiling mouth and that dancing light in his eyes which meant mischief to his enemies. Perhaps the bowman was honest enough. Perhaps he had meant to cheat, and then, finding himself alone with 2 of us in a desert place, cast back to honesty as being safer. At least, and all at once, he seemed to find that button and handed it to Allan. Well, and it is a good thing for the honor of the McCalls, said Allan, and then to me, Here is my button back again, and I thank you for parting with it, which is of a piece with all your friendships to me. Then he took the warmest parting of the bowman. For, says he, ye have done very well by me and set your neck at a venture, and I will always give you the name of a good man. Lastly, the bowman took himself off by one way, and Allan and I, getting our chattels together, struck into another to resume our flight. Chapter 22. The Flight in the Heather, the Moor. Some 7 hours' incessant hard traveling brought us early in the morning to the end of a range of mountains. In front of us there lay a piece of low, broken desert land which we must now cross. The sun was not long up and shone straight in our eyes. A little thin mist went up from the face of the moorland like a smoke, so that, as Allan said, there might have been 20 squadron of dragoons there, and we none the wiser. We sat down, therefore, in a howe of the hillside till the mist should have risen, and made ourselves a dish of drammock, and held a council of war. David, said Allan, this is the kittle bit. Shall we lie here till it comes night, or shall we risk it and stave on ahead? Well, said I am tired indeed, but I could walk as far again if that was all. Aye, but it isna, said Allan, nor yet the half. This is how we stand. Appin's fair death to us. To the south it's all Campbell's, and no to be thought of. To the north, well, there's no muckle to be gained by going north, neither for you that wants to get to Queensferry, nor yet for me that wants to get to France. Well, then, we can strike east. East be it, says I, quite cheerily, but I was thinking into myself, Oh, man, if you would only take one point of the compass and let me take any other, it would be the best for both of us. Well, then, east, you see, we have Muirs, said Allan. Once there, David, it's mere pitch and toss. Out on yon bald, naked, flat place, where can a body turn to? Let the redcoats come over a hill, they can spy you miles away, and the sorrows in their horses' heels, they would soon ride you down. It's no good place, David, and I'm free to say it's worse by daylight than by dark. Allan, said I, hear my way of it. Appin's death for us. We have none too much money, nor yet meal. The longer they seek, the nearer they may guess where we are. It's all a risk, and I give my word to go ahead until we drop. Allan was delighted. There are whiles, said he, when you are altogether too canny and Whiggish to be company for a gentleman like me. But there come other whiles when you show yourself a metal spark, and it's then, David, that I love you like a brother. The mist rose and died away, and showed us the country lying as waste as the sea, only the moorfowl and the peewees crying upon it, and far over to the east a herd of deer moving like dots. Much of it was red with heather, much of the rest broken up with bogs and hags and peaty pools. Some had been burnt black in a heath fire, and in another place there was quite a forest of dead firs, standing like skeletons. A wearier-looking desert man never saw, but at least it was clear of troops, which was our point. We went down accordingly into the waste and began to make our toilsome and devious travels toward the eastern verge. There were the tops of mountains all round, you are to remember, from whence we might be spied at any moment. So it behoved us to keep in the hollow parts of the moor, and when these turned aside from our direction, to move upon its naked face with infinite care. Sometimes, for a half an hour together, we must crawl from one heather bush to another, as hunters do when they are hard upon the deer. It was a clear day again, with a blazing sun. The water in the brandy bottle was soon gone, and altogether, if I had guessed what it would be to crawl half the time upon my belly, and to walk much of the rest stooping nearly to the knees, I should certainly have held back from such a killing enterprise. Toiling and resting and toiling again, we wore away the morning, and about noon lay down in a thick bush of heather to sleep. Allan took the first watch, and it seemed to me I had scarce closed my eyes before I was shaken up to take the second. We had no clock to go by, and Allan stuck a sprig of heath in the ground to serve instead, so that as soon as the shadow of the bush should fall so far to the east, I might know to rouse him. But I was by this time so weary that I could have slept 12 hours at a stretch. I had the taste of sleep in my throat. My joints slept even when my mind was waking. The hot smell of heather and the drone of the wild bees were like possets to me, and every now and again I would give a jump and find I had been dozing. The last time I woke, I seemed to come back from farther away, and thought the sun had taken a great start in the heavens. I looked at the sprig of heath, and at that I could have cried aloud, for I saw I had betrayed my trust. My head was nearly turned with fear and shame, and at what I saw when I looked out around me on the moor, my heart was like dying in my body. For sure enough, a body of horse soldiers had come down during my sleep, and were drawing near to us from the southeast, spread out in the shape of a fan, and riding their horses to and fro in the deep parts of the heather. When I waked Allan, he glanced first at the soldiers, then at the mark and the position of the sun, and knitted his brows with a sudden quick look, both ugly and anxious, which was all the reproach I had of him. "What are we to do now?" I asked. "We'll have to play at being hares," said he. "Do you see yon mountain?" pointing to one on the northeastern sky. "Aye," said I. "Well then," says he, "let us strike for that. Its name is Ben Alder. It is a wild, desert mountain full of hills and hollows, and if we can win to it before the morn, we may do yet." "But, Allan," cried I, "that will take us across the very coming of the soldiers." "I ken that fine," said he, "but if we are driven back on Appin, we are two dead men. So now, David, man, be brisk." Excuse me. With that he began to run forward on his hands and knees with an incredible quickness, as though it was his natural way of going. All the time, too, he kept winding in and out in the lower parts of the moorland, where we were the best concealed. Some of these had been burned or at least scathed with fire, and there rose in our faces, which were close to the ground, a blinding, choking dust as fine as smoke. The water was long out, and this posture of running on the hands and knees brings an overmastering weakness and weariness, so that the joints ache and the wrists faint under your weight. Now and then, indeed, where was a big bush of heather, we lay a while and panted, and putting aside the leaves, looked back at the dragoons. They had not spied us, for they held straight on, a half-troop, I think, covering about 2 miles of ground and beating it mighty thoroughly as they went. I had awakened just in time. A little later, and we might have fled in front of them instead of escaping on one side. Even as it was, the least misfortune might betray us, and now and again, when a grouse rose out of the heather with a clap of wings, we lay as still as the dead and were afraid to breathe. The aching and faintness of my body, the laboring of my heart, the soreness of my hands, and the smarting of my throat and eyes in the continual smoke of dust and ashes had soon grown to be so unbearable that I would gladly have given up. Nothing but the fear of Allen lent me enough of a false kind of courage to continue. As for himself, and you are to bear in mind that he was cumbered with a greatcoat, he had first turned crimson, but as time went on the redness began to be mingled with patches of white. His breath cried and whistled as it came, and his voice, when he whispered his observations in my ear during our halts, sounded like nothing human. Yet he seemed in no way dashed in spirits, nor did he at all abate in his activity, so that I was driven to marvel at the man's endurance. At length, in the first gloaming of the night, we heard a trumpet sound, and looking back from among the heather, saw the troop beginning to collect. A little after, they had built a fire and camped for the night about the middle of the waste. At this I begged and besought that we might lie down and sleep. "There shall be no sleep this night," said Allen. "From now on, these weary dragoons of yours will keep the crown of the muirland, and none will get out of Appin but winged fowls. We got through in the nick of time, and shall we jeopard what we've gained? Na, when the day comes, it shall find you and me in a fast place on Ben Alder." "Allen," I said, "it's not the want of will, it's the strength that I want. If I could, I would, but as sure as I'm alive, I cannot." "Very well then," said Allen, "I'll carry ye." I looked to see if he were jesting, but no, the little man was in dead earnest, and the sight of so much resolution shamed me. "Lead away," said I, "I'll follow." He gave me one look as much as to say, "Well done, David," and off he set again at his top speed. It grew cooler and even a little darker, but not much, with the coming of the night. The sky was cloudless. It was still early in July and pretty far north. In the darkest part of that night you would have needed pretty good eyes to read, but for all that I have often seen it darker in a winter midday. Heavy dew fell and drenched the moor like rain, and this refreshed me for a while. When we stopped to breathe and I had time to see all about me, the clearness and sweetness of the night, the shapes of the hills like things asleep, and the fire dwindling away behind us like a bright spot in the midst of the moor, anger would come upon me in a clap that I must still drag myself in agony, and eat the dust like a worm. By what I have read in books, I think few that have held a pen were ever really wearied, or they would write of it more strongly. I had no care of my life, neither past nor future, and I scarce remembered there was such a lad as David Balfour. I did not think of myself, but just of each fresh step, which I was sure would be my last, with despair, and of Allen, who was the cause of it, with hatred. Allen was in the right trade as a soldier. This is the officer's part, to make men continue to do things they know not wherefore, and when, if the choice was offered, they would lie down where they were and be killed. And I dare say I would have made a good enough private, for in these last hours it never occurred to me that I had any choice but just to obey as long as I was able, and die obeying. Day began to come in, after years, I thought, and by that time we were past the greatest danger, and could walk upon our feet like men instead of crawling like brutes. But, dear heart, have mercy. What a pair we must have made, going double like old grandfathers, stumbling like babes, and as white as dead folk. Never a word passed between us. Each set his mouth and kept his eyes in front of him, and lifted up his foot and set it down again, like people lifting weights at a country play. All the while with the moorfowl crying peep in the heather and the light coming slowly clearer in the east. I say Allen did as I did, not that ever I looked at him, for I had enough ado to keep my feet, but because it is plain he must have been as stupid with weariness as myself, and looked as little where we were going, or we should not have walked into an ambush like blind men. It fell in this way. We were going down a heathery brae, Allen leading and I following a pace or two behind, like a fiddler and his wife, when upon a sudden the heather gave a rustle. 3 or 4 ragged men leaped out, and the next moment we were lying on our backs, each with the dirk at his throat. I don't think I cared. The pain of this rough handling was quite swallowed up by the pains of which I was already full, and I was too glad to have stopped walking to mind about a dirk. I lay looking up in the face of the man that held me, and I mind his face was black with the sun and his eyes very light, but I was not afraid of him. I heard Alan and another whispering in the Gaelic, and what they said was all one to me. Then the dirks were put up, our weapons were taken away, and we were set face to face, sitting in the heather. "They are Cluny's men," said Alan. "We couldn't have fallen better. We're just to bide here with these, which are his out-sentries, till they can get word to the chief of my arrival." Now Cluny Macpherson, the chief of the clan Vowric, had been one of the leaders of the great rebellion 6 years before. There was a price on his life, and I had supposed him long ago in France, with the rest of the heads of that desperate party. Even tired as I was, the surprise of what I heard half wakened me. "What?" I cried. "Is Cluny still here?" "Aye, he is so," said Alan, "still in his own country and kept by his own clan. King George can do no more." I think I would have asked further, but Alan gave me the put-off. "I am rather wearied," he said, "and I would like fine to get asleep." And without more words, he rolled on his face in a deep heather bush and seemed to sleep at once. There was no such thing possible for me. You have heard grasshoppers whirring in the grass in the summer-time? Well, I had no sooner closed my eyes than my body, and above all my head, belly, and wrists, seemed to fill with whirring grasshoppers, and I must open my eyes again at once, and tumble and toss and sit up and lie down, and look at the sky which dazzled me, or at Cluny's wild and dirty sentries, peering out over the top of the brae and chattering to each other in the Gaelic. That was all the rest I had until the messenger returned, when, as it appeared that Cluny would be glad to receive us, we must get once more upon our feet and set forward. Alan was in excellent good spirits, much refreshed by his sleep, very hungry, and looking pleasantly forward to a dram and a dish of hot collops, of which it seems the messenger had brought him word. For my part, it made me sick to hear of eating. I had been dead heavy before, and now I felt a sort of dreadful lightness which would not suffer me to walk. I drifted like a gossamer. The ground seemed to me a cloud, the hills a featherweight, the air to have a current like a running burn which carried me to and fro. With all that, a sort of horror of despair sat on my mind so that I could have wept at my own helplessness. I saw Alan knitting his brows at me, and supposed it was in anger, and that gave me a pang of light-headed fear like what a child may have. But I remember, too, that I was smiling, and could not stop smiling, hard as I tried, for I thought it was out of place at such a time. But my good companion had nothing in his mind but kindness, and the next moment 2 of the gillies had me by the arms, and I began to be carried forward with great swiftness, or so it appeared to me, although I dare say it was slowly enough in truth, through a labyrinth of dreary glens and hollows, and into the heart of that dismal mountain of Ben Alder. Thank you for watching and listening, and next time we'll start with chapter 23. Bye-bye.